Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. Can you hear me? Yes. I think so, just about. Great. Okay. I won't risk offending the whole room by saying a few words in Japanese. I did think about it, but Duolingo wasn't my best friend in the end over the last few days. But I'm extremely happy to be here. This is my first time in Japan. I'm absolutely delighted to be able to come all the way out to Okinawa, and it's a real joy to spend this whole week at OIST with Heather and her amazing team. So thank you so much to the JSF committee for inviting me and for having me here. So I'm talking for no more than 30 minutes, someone's keeping time, and I'm talking about some of my experience, but obviously that's reasonably narrow. I've been based entirely in the UK, so it's worth just bearing that in mind. It's something I'm always aware of, and really I'm here as much as anything this week to learn from you about science communication in the Japanese context and what that can teach us. And I just wanted to say that, my personal view is it's incredibly important for communicators to get together regularly. Some of us are in small teams, or maybe even working alone. And I think communications is such a special and creative professional field of practice that really stands apart from many of the other management professions that we're working with. And I was trying to create a kind of microculture in communications in my teams, because I think that creativity operates in a certain way that's quite different and unique. And in fact, I'm going to spend 30 minutes talking about that and what I think makes communications people so brilliant. And I won't dwell on any of the negatives because we're here to have a good time. So I promised to talk about the story of science, which is quite a bold claim. Obviously, science is actually many stories. But I'll just start by highlighting one story about the beginning of evolutionary biology. And I apologise, first of all, for talking about British history, something we often do. And if you've heard this story before, but I think it's kind of suggests how important storytelling is within science. So this is a letter published in 1858 in the Proceedings of the Linnaean Society, and it introduced 4 papers written by Charles Darwin and Alfred Wallace. Separate papers, but they were on the same idea of evolution by natural selection, which we know was a monumental theory with a kind of significance that it would be hard to put into words. But what was embarrassing later that year were the comments made by Thomas Bell, who was the president of the Linnaean Society at the time, and he said this, looking back on that year, that it has not indeed been marked by any of those striking discoveries which at once revolutionised the Department of Science on which they bear. And that became known as one of the biggest sort of misjudgments in the history of science. So he had quite a bad day in the office. And I don't know if you've had a Thomas Bell moment yourself. I have. In the late 1990s, I stood in the production offices of the BBC and put forward my theory to anyone who would listen that the internet would never take off. And if you're my kind of age, you probably remember how terrible the early websites were. But what happened next was Darwin published this book on the origin of species, and this used a different type of narrative than you'd find in a scientific paper to put his ideas across, and this was the moment when scientists really took notice of what he was saying. And I describe that just to emphasize really that how we tell the story of science really matters, and not just for the relationship between science and the non-scientific world, but actually for scientific progress itself. So thinking about how we tell the story has a big impact. And I also promised to talk about valuing specialist communicators in a technical world, which kind of suggests that I might think we're not adequately valued. And I think we are. I think everything's improving, investment is increasing in the work that we do. But what I would say is that it is still my experience on an unfortunately regular basis to encounter just a misunderstanding of what it takes to communicate well, the professionalism that we're all developing, the technical skills as well as the creative, and how much goes into a really great piece of communications. So I'm going to say a bit about that. And I think potentially, one of the challenges for communications, and one of the things that makes it a wonderful profession, is that there's many different routes into it and there's many different types of role within it. So I thought I'd just say something about my route to the job that I currently do, which is probably typically atypical of any other route. But I did have two experiences quite early on in my career that really emphasised the kind of technical and creative challenges I was going to face throughout my career. So I did manage to get a biology degree in the early 90s. That was enough to tell me that I would never make a career as a scientist, and my dissertation supervisor who let me in the lab would definitely have confirmed that robustly. So also I failed to get any graduate jobs. So I decided, what did I really want to do? And I thought, I might as well try something creative. So I wrote to my local radio station in Cambridge, BBC local radio station. I got a very junior job working in what was called the CD library. Some of you are probably too young to remember CDs, but that was where we filed the CDs, but they would let me out occasionally to record interviews and start learning the technical and creative craft of radio production. So one job I was given that no one else wanted to do was to interview a pop group who had released a single that I thought was absolutely terrible, but it had sold 500,000 copies, and they were coming to a shop in Cambridge to pick up a platinum award. And you may or may not have heard of this group. They were called the Spice Girls, and the single was Wannabe, and I'm sorry if that's a reference that's just very British and of a certain time. Anyway, they were spectacularly popular. And there was a lot going on that day with photographers and fans. And I did manage to conduct this interview. And I thought it had gone really well. And I was getting in the car to go home. And I realised that tape players were a bit complicated in those days. I hadn't actually pressed record. So that was another one of my really bad days in the office. And I had to go back and beg for them to do it again. And because they weren't that famous at that stage, they actually agreed. But what that showed me, I think, was the pressure there is in communications to get absolutely everything right. I think this is something that people in other professions or management professions in an organisation don't appreciate, is the level of exposure of everything you do. So there's someone here today, and I can't see her, who runs the social media accounts. 50,000 people are watching, so if you make a mistake there, that can stay there for a very long time. People are watching and ready to criticise, and it's one of the real skills of communications, is to learn to manage that pressure. Anyway, despite that disaster, I did actually get promoted to a national radio role, and my first job was to make a 3-part series about the science of horse racing, which was quite interesting. So I spent weeks and weeks conducting interviews with vets and scientists and racehorse owners in the town of Newmarket, which is the home of British racing, and days and days and days editing the audio down to about 25 minutes. And in those days, we used to record on magnetic tape, so I had a great big reel of tape, and I played this audio to my editor before the studio. And she was listening on double speed while having a conversation with someone and just sort of scrolling through the programme. And she went right back to the beginning, and she got a big razor blade out, that's what we did in those days, cut the tape, started listening again, and she was spooling it into the bin. And this went on for quite a long while, and I was getting increasingly nervous and anxious. And she stopped at a certain point and said, "Start the programme here." And that was the right decision, but I had just lost 7 minutes of my 25 minutes of audio and had to go back out and basically make half a programme from scratch again. And I think that was another one of my bad days in the office. I've had quite a few. That was where I learned, I think, that making a narrative that's powerful enough that a really big and broad audience can engage with it on a high-profile and credible sort of national radio station is not something you can pick up overnight. It's actually a craft that develops over a whole career. And I think so much of what we do is really based on that craft. So what really counts in communications? So much of it, I think, still boils down to how and where to start a story and exactly which words to use. So anyone who's had a couple of hours just staring at a blank page, wondering which words to use to start a press release, that is the job of comms. It's what we learn. We get really good at it over a whole career, and it should be valued and appreciated. And I think this combination of creative and technical skills is what sort of sets us apart as specialists. I mean, I've had comments on a periodic basis saying things like, well, we all communicate all the time, Ali, so why do we need a communications team? And the best answer, the one I like to give to that question is, well, we all have a bank account that we manage, so why do we need a finance team? And I think the difference is, it's about the scale of the audiences we're communicating with, the complexity of the many multiple messages and their nuances that we're trying to get across, and our accountability for when things go wrong. It doesn't much matter in a one-to-one conversation. If you make a mistake, you can put it right quickly. And that matters particularly with science, obviously. So, the work, I think, that we're engaged in really matters. If science is important, so is communications. And it's not always appreciated, but Darwin knew that it really mattered. And I just want to describe my technical world then. This is the Francis Crick Institute that Nick knows well. This is in central London. It's next to King's Cross Station, and it opened 5 years ago, so younger than OIST, and very condensed compared to your beautiful, spacious campus here. So as well as this building above ground, there's almost the same underground. We've got experimental space and equipment in a 4-story basement underground. And this is Europe's largest biomedical science laboratory under a single roof, something I'm very used to saying. And quite similar to OIST in that we're graduate only, and we have a focus on basic or fundamental discovery, although we do a lot of translational research as well. And we're funded partly by the government, which is ultimately, of course, the taxpayer, but also by charity. So we've got a handful of philanthropists making major donations, and millions of people giving small amounts through Cancer Research UK. And then we've got an endowment charity, the Wellcome Trust. Now here's some of our people. I don't know if you're in this, Nick. This was taken a while ago. We've got about 1,500 scientists, sort of something like 140 research groups, about 50 PhD students, and we cover a broad range of biomedical science. We try to avoid hierarchy. We don't have departments, very similar to what you've heard about OIST today. And we're really designed to promote interaction across disciplines. So our scientists don't have to teach undergrads. They're core funded, so they don't rely on grant funding in the same way as others might do. And they have access to an amazing technical core for experimentation. They get given real freedom, I think, to follow their curiosity. So it was designed by scientists for scientists. And so I'm always amazed at how much they still find to complain about. And of course, a lot of those complaints come to me. But I think there's something about the pressure of academia. It's not a job I feel I could ever do. Real pressure around a performance culture and being excellent. And I think the 3 things that we try and say about the Crick in all of our communications is that we have a focus on quality of scholarship, the benefit we bring to society, and the vibrancy of our institute and what we try and bring to the practice of science. So in our team, which I am lucky enough to steer, we're trying to do 2 things principally. So first of all, and this is the bit that we often don't describe in strategy, but it takes a huge amount of time and it's critical to our work, is we're trying to support the operational effectiveness of the Crick. And we do that by straightforward communication with staff and stakeholders. We try and engage people in our strategy, get them to input into it, be inspired by it. We undertake government affairs to try and lobby on certain issues. And we also try and inspire our philanthropists to partner with us even more effectively and sell and market, I guess, some of what the Crick does in our commercial services. But then with a different logic altogether, really. We were founded on one of our 5 strategic pillars of the Crick, which is we engage and inspire the public with discovery science. And we do this for a lot of reasons, but we're trying to essentially bring people into a relationship with science. And we like to say to generate empathy and equity between the scientist and the non-scientist, as well as many other benefits of that. So we're organised into these 4 teams. On the left-hand side is principally communications, and the new development for us, I'm going to say something about it briefly, is digital. This was a bit underinvested in given the enormous opportunity and huge challenges for anyone who's working in the digital space. So we're really developing that as fast as we can. And then on public engagement, which is really these 2 teams on the right-hand side, we have a very considerable education outreach program, so they have their own separate team, but these 2 teams work very closely together. There's about 10 people in each of these teams at the moment. Here we are in action. So top left is the Western Discovery Lab, which is a laboratory classroom at the front of the Crick. And so the education outreach program sees, we're located in a borough of London called Camden, and the program sees every single school child in Camden from the age of 5 to 18 once a year for a hands-on science experience, and we work closely with the teachers to design that. So that's 20,000 children who we see every year for their entire school careers. So as you can imagine, that's a big undertaking. And then top right is our exhibition space that we've got in the building, and this is an exhibition called Cut and Paste, which was really enjoyable and quite interesting. We were asking the public, this was a dialogue exhibition really, how far would you go in editing genes? And that threw up quite a number of interesting discussions. And then this is our auditorium, bottom left, and we sometimes put on public engagement lectures. Does anyone recognise bottom right who that is? Too British? This is Brian Cox, Professor Brian Cox, and he came to talk to us about how he explains very, very complex theories about what's happening in the universe. I think I probably got about 15 minutes in before. I was enjoying the talk, but not necessarily following it. I think he ramped it up because he had an audience of scientists. So, yes. So this all represents a sizable investment. And I think in terms of strategy, what I'm trying to do is bring together, although they operate under slightly different logics, communications with public engagement. And I think that happens when you make your entire focus about relationship building. And so our strategy at the Crick is discovery without boundaries, and that really is a scientific strategy focused on interdisciplinarity. But it's really actually quite helpful for communications because there's a boundary around our organisation that describes the difference between the internal world of the Crick and the external world. And boundaries are being created by discovery all the time between one expert and another, or between science and non-science. And what we're trying to focus on is overcoming those boundaries, using those boundaries to connect with people and trying to relate across those boundaries as far as we can. And so much of that comes down to agreeing a common language to communicate with each other, a two-way conversation to try and build that relationship. And I think that kind of thought process tends to move us away from promoting and selling, which risks spinning, and towards connecting person to person through dialogue. And that's a principle that we're very committed to. So this thing is the digital world, although I got it from PowerPoint. I don't know if anyone recognises that picture. So this is a major challenge, I think, strategically for certainly for our team. And we're asking, how can we find and relate to a bigger audience in the digital world? And of course, that should be easy, because the internet really did take off. So we can just put it on the homepage and everyone will come and look at our lovely content. But what we're really seeing now is a need to develop a very tightly integrated strategy for our content, for our platforms, and other people's platforms, if we want to use those, and our audiences. And we've been working on this for about 6 months, and we've got about another 3 or 4 months to go to get that strategy together. It's a really, really difficult space, I think, at the moment. And the question I think I've been asking since I joined the Crick was, to what extent can we now make our own content and share that in a digital space so that we can bypass the need to use other forms of journalists or mainstream media? Can we create our own channels and our own content that we can be in control of, and how can we get people to that content? So my kind of working hypothesis is, yes, that should be possible, but it needs to be done in partnership. So we spend a lot of time at the moment talking to production companies, animators, visual effects producers, commissioners, and all kinds of people who are already making or commissioning amazing content, because there's 2 things that work really well if you want to build an audience. One is a famous face, and the second is an established channel that already has thousands or hundreds of thousands or even millions of people associated with it. And I do think there's big potential here for science institutes to form a partnership, just be really honest about what they're trying to achieve, and potentially attract sponsorship or philanthropy or even venture capital investment to try to bring some of these science stories to a wider audience. Because I don't know what it's like over here, but in the UK, television budgets are under huge pressure, so some of the science documentaries we used to see that were very useful just don't get commissioned, and there's a really big problem with life sciences, which, as Nick said, is very messy, very complex, not always a simple idea. But one of the things we can do to drive audience, and really I just wanted to share these lovely pictures, is try and participate more in some mainstream programming to bring science at least into some sort of public awareness. So obviously we're raising the profile of the Crick, but by doing that we're also getting science more in the public eye. So on the top right there is a TV series called MasterChef, and I don't know if that's a syndicated program in some parts of the world, but it's a cookery competition. So for the semi-final, they came to the Crick, took over our kitchens, and 3 poor competitors had to cook for, these aren't our Nobel Prize-winning scientists, but there were a couple, around a table. And that's a really big audience in the UK. It was a kind of interesting place to put science. And the next day after that was broadcast, we saw a 5-fold increase in Google searches using the term Crick. So these kinds of things can get your name out there, might just spark an interest. Our building looks lovely, not as nice as yours in some respects. Love the jungle here. But, you know, nice to see that on television, and that might just be enough to get a young person to go online, have a look at our website, and start thinking about being a scientist. This show, bottom right, does something quite interesting. Again, it's with Brian Cox, and it brings a new audience to science by combining science with comedy. This is a radio show and a podcast, and it has had at least 24 million downloads. So they came and recorded that in our auditorium at the Crick, and they focused on our ancient DNA lab. And of course, our chief executive, I don't know if you recognise him, with the white hair there, Paul Nurse, was invited onto the panel as well. So on the left-hand side, this is a recent thing. We had Stand Up to Cancer, came and turned the whole of the Crick into basically a TV studio for a major fundraising telethon. All the stars were there of comedy in the UK. And again, these are moments where you can really build a profile, and you've got a sudden opportunity then. People will start Google searching your institute to gain further audiences for our digital channels. So there's a lot going on in this space, and I know there's plenty coming up on the agenda for the meeting about this. it takes a lot of thought. And I think it really highlights for me what I see as the three key things that a communication strategy brings, and hopefully brings them together to get into the middle of the Venn diagram. And that is a creative vision. So have we got a strong vision for how to express our story as an institute, but also how we want to tell the story of our science in words and pictures. Analytical insight, communicators tend to be very, very focused on context, because you can't tell a good story and drop it into a context where it won't work. And measurable precision, so can we get really targeted about audiences, deliver communications and measure outcomes. So it's an art and a science, communications, and it has a unique perspective. I think it's the only part of the organisation has exactly the same viewpoint as the chief executive. We have to cover everything. We can't really say, well, that's finance or that's HR. Everything is comms, and we have to have a real helicopter view, but then be able to dive in to any issue that emerges, usually unpredictably, at any time. So I wanted you to see some of the Crick live. So I'm just going to play a 2-minute film that kind of exemplifies some of this stuff that we're working on. So this is a film that was shot on an iPhone and edited in an afternoon on a Friday at the Crick. So very quick to do. We sent this film ahead of a Zoom meeting we were having with BBC Education's exec team, because we would like to partner with them to bring our education outreach programme through one of their established channels called Bite Size, which is a big online education channel. And we just thought they weren't going to get any sense of the Crick from seeing us on Zoom. So we sent them a film that I hope you might be able to see.
Welcome to the Crick. I'm Ellie and I work in the education team here. I'm here to give you a tour, introduce you to what we do, the people who do it, and what makes it so special. This way. Labs. We've got loads of them, filled with the brightest and best young scientists from across the UK and the globe.
Hello! I'm Tom. I spend my time drilling into the bones of people who died thousands of years ago in order to extract their DNA. And so we can see how people changed over time as a result of evolution and migration. So as well as spending time in the lab, I also spend a lot of the time in graveyards.
My name's Ganesh, and I've always wanted to be a scientist. The reason why is because I really like asking big questions, like how do babies become males or females? Working in an institute like this allows me to ask those questions, and if we understand how the world works, then we're in a better position to actually be able to offer cures and solutions for when things go wrong.
Hi, I'm Nana. I'm a scientist and I'm researching cancer. What is it? Well, your body is like an amazing house made up of individual bricks. We call those bricks cells. They do an incredible job of growing and dividing and keeping the whole structure together. When a patient has cancer, some of those cells have gotten confused. Here at the Crick, we've got incredible technologies to look at the blueprint, the map that those cells use, and we're trying to understand them. If we can do that, we can come up with new treatments for cancer.
Next up is our gallery space, where our current exhibition, Cut and Paste, explores the ethics around gene editing. And here is where our teaching happened.
Hello, welcome to the Discovery Lab. I'm Danny, and we get to reach every child every year in Camden to bring them really fun hands-on workshops, all about science. So we start from year 1 and can go all the way up through T levels, hopefully. And in year 5, they get to come to us, and that's what I'm setting up right now. So in the morning, we do a bit of chemistry, where we talk about how atoms can come together to make a whole range of different things, just like how hydrogen peroxide can become oxygen and water. Or how some particles can interact differently depending on the force applied. In the afternoon, we get to work on circuits to help us understand physics.
So that's us and the end of your Whistle Stop tour. Want to know more? Come and find us.
There we go. So come and find us yourself, by the way. If you're ever in London, it would be lovely to see you. But I think you'll agree we've got some amazing presenting talent right there that we wanted people to see. And I think, you know, this skill set that we're having to sort of bring into our teams now Can you make a little creative film? And I mean, we could talk ad infinitum about social media channels, TikTok and the lot, but it's certainly changing the field of communications quite radically since I joined it many, many years ago. So I just got one final couple of final things to say, which is that, you know, in my view, in my experience, I really believe that the communications team in any organisation is actually the heart and soul of that organisation. And when it works really well, it can light the whole place up. You really need to look at the communications team to see the culture of the organisation you're in, and many, many, many brilliant people are working in those teams. And I think on a deeper level, you know, one of the great challenges of being human in the world is, how do I speak to the person in front of me in a way that builds our connection with each other and doesn't sabotage it? And I think this is the work that we do in communications, and a lot of that comes down, like I say, to choosing the right language and the right words to use. I think now more than ever, in all walks of life, this is a really noble purpose to have, and it's a career that I think we should all be proud to work in. So thank you very much for listening. I'm happy to take questions.